If you're reading this because you enjoy true confessions, I guess mine belongs here more than anywhere else. My name's William. I'm not proud of the things I've done, but pretending they never happened would be another lie on top of a lifetime of them. Some people collect souvenirs. I collected crimes. Most of them had reasons that made perfect sense to me at the time, even if they sound monstrous now. This story started with a funeral. An elderly man named Arthur Bennett died at 86. To most people, he was a respected businessman with no children and no close family worth mentioning. To me, he was an opportunity. I'd spent months around people connected to his estate, listening more than talking, learning who expected to inherit and who had already started spending money they didn't officially own. Then everything changed. A week before the will was supposed to be read, rumors began spreading about an unknown heir, a person nobody had ever heard of. Someone who had suddenly appeared with documents, photographs, and a story convincing enough that Arthur's lawyers postponed everything. That single announcement transformed polite relatives into desperate strangers. Smiles disappeared. Accusations started. Everyone wanted to know who this mystery beneficiary was. Including me. Because I already had plans involving that inheritance. And the appearance of one unexpected person was about to destroy months of careful preparation. I wish I could say that's when I walked away. Instead, that's when I decided to commit the worst crime of my life. The moment I heard the will had been delayed, I knew panic would make everyone else careless. That's how people work. The wealthy relatives started arguing with the lawyers, reporters circled the family home, and everyone obsessed over one question: who was the unknown heir? I decided not to chase rumors. Rumors waste time. Facts don't. I rented a small apartment across from the law office where Arthur's estate was being handled. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a perfect view of who came and went. I bought cheap clothes that blended into the neighborhood, changed my hairstyle, and kept a notebook filled with names, license plates, and schedules. Looking ordinary is a skill most people underestimate. I wasn't planning violence. At least, that was the lie I kept telling myself. My goal was simple. Learn the heir's identity before anyone else and use that knowledge to secure the inheritance for myself through deception. I convinced myself it was just another elaborate con. I had no idea how quickly that plan would spiral into something far darker. 3 days into my little stakeout, I finally saw the person everyone had been whispering about. They didn't arrive in an expensive car or with an entourage of lawyers. They came alone, carrying a worn leather folder like it contained their entire life. There was nothing dramatic about them, which somehow made them even more dangerous to my plans. Real stories rarely look impressive from the outside. I followed at a distance after they left the office, careful not to draw attention. They stopped at a quiet cafe, spread old photographs across the table, and spent nearly an hour speaking with an elderly woman who seemed to recognize every face in those pictures. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. Their expressions told me enough. Whatever claim this stranger had, they genuinely believed it. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. If they were telling the truth, then everyone else, including me, had built fantasies around money that had never belonged to us. Instead of taking that as a sign to walk away, I started convincing myself that truth didn't matter nearly as much as who could control the story. That evening I stopped pretending I was only observing. Up until then, I'd been telling myself I was gathering information, nothing more. But information has a way of becoming temptation. The more I learned about the stranger, the more convinced I became that their arrival had ruined the future I'd spent months imagining. I started building a routine around them. Every morning they visited the same bakery before heading to meetings with the estate attorneys. Every afternoon they returned to a modest hotel on the edge of town. Predictable habits are comforting to ordinary people. To someone like I was back then, they looked like opportunities. I even managed to start a casual conversation with the hotel receptionist, pretending to be a distant family acquaintance hoping to surprise an old friend. People reveal astonishing amounts of information when they think they're helping. That should have been enough for me to admit I'd gone too far. Instead, I left the hotel with a copy of the stranger's schedule, a growing sense of confidence, and the dangerous belief that I was still in control. Looking back, that was the moment the crime truly began, not because I'd broken the law in any spectacular way, but because I'd stopped seeing another human being as a person and started seeing them as an obstacle. The more I watched, the less my original scheme made sense. I had imagined slipping into the chaos surrounding the estate, forging just enough paperwork to confuse people, and walking away with money before anyone noticed. That fantasy depended on uncertainty. The unknown heir threatened to erase all of it with a single verified identity. So I adapted. Instead of trying to become part of the inheritance, I decided to interfere with the process itself. My thinking was cold and embarrassingly simple. If the evidence supporting the heir's claim disappeared, the legal battle would drag on for months, maybe years. In that confusion, other opportunities might appear. I studied the law office's routines rather than focusing on the heir alone. Deliveries arrived every Tuesday morning. Employees took lunch at staggered times, but the records room was often unattended for short stretches. I memorized entrances, cameras, and exits, convincing myself I was only preparing for every possibility. That kind of planning feels strangely satisfying. Every detail solved gives you a false sense of mastery. You stop asking whether you should do something and become obsessed with whether you can. Looking back, that's the most dangerous shift I ever experienced, the moment curiosity turned into intent. I picked a weekday because I assumed everyone would be too busy to notice one more face in the building. Confidence has a way of making bad ideas sound reasonable. I walked in wearing clothes that looked forgettable, carrying an ordinary folder under my arm, acting as though I belonged there. Nobody stopped me. That was the first mistake, mine, not theirs, because it convinced me I was smarter than everyone else. The records I wanted weren't where I'd expected. Staff members were moving between offices, conversations echoed through the hallway, and the routine I'd spent days studying suddenly meant very little. Real life refused to follow the neat pattern I'd imagined. Then I saw the unknown heir speaking quietly with one of the attorneys. They looked relieved, almost hopeful, as if years of uncertainty were finally coming to an end. For a split second I considered walking away and accepting that I'd lost. Instead, I let desperation make the decision for me. What happened next wasn't part of any plan I'd rehearsed. It was a choice made in panic, and that single impulsive moment changed far more than an inheritance ever could. The attorney stepped away to answer a phone call, leaving the unknown heir alone in a small consultation room with that worn leather folder resting on the table. I remember standing in the hallway, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out every sensible thought. I told myself that if I could get my hands on those papers, even for a few minutes, I could figure out exactly what made their claims so convincing. When the opportunity appeared, I acted without thinking. I slipped into the room, exchanged a few awkward words, and created enough confusion to walk out with the folder while its owner was distracted. It wasn't some masterstroke. It was clumsy, reckless, and fueled by pure adrenaline. The problem was that I hadn't planned for people to react so quickly. Within minutes, staff members realized something was wrong. Doors were checked, phones started ringing, and anxious conversations spread through the office. I ducked into a quiet stairwell, opened the folder with trembling hands, and discovered something I never expected. The documents weren't just legal records. They were deeply personal old letters, family photographs, and proof of a relationship that had been hidden for decades. In that instant, the stranger stopped being an obstacle in my mind. They became a real person whose life I'd just turned upside down. I escaped the building before anyone could connect me to the missing folder, but there wasn't any feeling of victory waiting outside. I sat in my car with the engine off, staring at the papers spread across the passenger seat. The excitement that had carried me through those frantic minutes vanished almost immediately, replaced by something much heavier. The letters told a story no courtroom summary ever could. Arthur had known about the heir for years. Circumstances, pride, and fear had kept them apart, but the documents made one thing painfully clear: the inheritance wasn't the result of a clever scam. It was an attempt to correct a lifetime of regret. That realization should have sent me straight back to return everything. Instead, I froze. News spread quickly. By evening, employees at the law office were talking about stolen documents, and the heir's name began circulating among people who had no business knowing it. I watched from a distance as suspicion fell on relatives, assistants, even one of the attorneys. Innocent people were forced to defend themselves because of something I had done. For the first time, I understood that crimes don't end when you walk away. They keep unfolding long after the moment itself, pulling strangers into consequences they never chose. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the heir sitting in that consultation room, realizing the folder was gone. I kept telling myself I hadn't meant for things to spiral this far, but intentions didn't change what I'd actually done. The papers were still in my possession, and innocent people were still under suspicion. By morning, I convinced myself there was a way to fix it without exposing my role. I made copies of the documents, sealed the originals in an envelope, and planned to return them anonymously. It sounded clever in my head: leave the folder where it could be found, disappear before anyone noticed, and let the investigation take another direction. Reality, as usual, ignored my script. When I arrived near the law office, police officers were already interviewing employees and reviewing security footage. Reporters lingered outside, hoping for a statement about the missing evidence and the delayed reading of the will. Suddenly, returning the documents wasn't as simple as slipping them through a doorway. I turned around and walked away. That decision haunted me more than the theft itself. Every step I took felt like another choice to protect myself instead of correcting the harm I'd caused. The longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine making things right. For several days, I avoided every place connected to the estate. I stopped watching the law office, ignored the news, and convinced myself that staying invisible was the safest option. But guilt has a way of following you into every quiet moment. I'd catch myself reaching for the folder, rereading the letters, as if they might suddenly offer a solution they hadn't offered the night before. Then my phone rang. The caller introduced themselves as the unknown heir. I still don't know how they found my number. Maybe someone had noticed me around the office, or maybe I'd been less careful than I believed. They didn't accuse me of anything. They simply asked if we could meet because they thought I knew something about what had happened. That calmness unsettled me more than anger ever could. We met in a quiet public park. I expected shouting, threats, or demands. Instead, they spoke about Arthur. Not the money, not the inheritance, but the years they had lost without knowing him. Listening to them, I realized I'd reduced an entire human life to a stack of documents standing between me and a payday. For the first time since this began, I couldn't justify my actions, even to myself. I carried the folder to our meeting in a plain backpack, though I hadn't decided whether I was actually going to hand it over. Part of me still searched for some impossible outcome where I could erase what I'd done without admitting I'd done it. But the moment I saw the heir waiting on the park bench, looking exhausted rather than angry, that fantasy collapsed. I sat down and told them everything. Not every detail of my past, those stories belong elsewhere, but everything about this crime. I admitted that I'd followed them, learned their routine, stolen the folder, and let my greed blind me to the damage I was causing. They didn't interrupt. They just listened, their expression growing quieter with every sentence. When I finally placed the folder between us, neither of us reached for it immediately. It felt strangely symbolic, as though it carried more than papers. It carried every selfish decision I'd made over the previous weeks. The heir eventually took it back and thanked me for returning it, but they also said something I still remember: doing the right thing now doesn't erase doing the wrong thing before. They were right. Some apologies begin healing. None of them rewrite history. Returning the folder didn't end the story. In some ways, it was only the beginning. I knew the heir had every reason to report me, and I spent the next several days expecting a knock at my door. Every passing car made me glance through the curtains. Every unfamiliar number on my phone made my stomach tighten. Eventually, I learned that the documents had been given back to the attorneys along with an explanation that they had been recovered. The investigation continued, but it never unfolded the way I'd imagined. I still had to face the consequences of my actions, answer difficult questions, and accept responsibility for the theft instead of hiding behind excuses. The inheritance dispute was finally resolved, and the rightful heir received what Arthur had intended to leave behind. Watching it happen from a distance was strangely humbling. For months, I'd convinced myself that money was the center of the story. In reality, it had always been about family, regret, and a final attempt to make peace with the past. Losing my chance at easy money hurt my pride. Accepting that I'd nearly destroyed someone else's chance at closure hurt far more. People often imagine that the hardest part of committing a crime is the moment you're caught. For me, the hardest part came afterward, when life became ordinary again. Bills still arrived. The sun still came up every morning. Neighbors still smiled and waved as if I were just another person walking down the street. The world moved on, but I couldn't. I stopped chasing shortcuts after that. Not because I suddenly became noble, but because I finally understood how easily one selfish decision can spill into the lives of people you've never even met. I had convinced myself that I was playing a clever game against wealthy strangers. Instead, I had become the source of someone else's grief and uncertainty. Every now and then I wonder what would have happened if I'd walked away the first time I heard about the unknown heir. My life would have looked very different. So would theirs. That's the strange thing about regret. It doesn't replay the crime itself. It replays the moment when you still had a choice to become someone else and reminds you that you chose not to. Looking back now, I can trace every mistake to a single belief: I thought I deserved something simply because I'd spent time planning for it. I confused effort with entitlement. Months of observation, careful notes, and elaborate schemes made me feel as though the inheritance had somehow become mine in spirit, even though it never belonged to me in reality. The unknown heir didn't steal my future. They revealed the truth about it. The future I'd imagined had always depended on taking advantage of someone else's loss. I just refused to admit that until everything fell apart. People sometimes ask whether I regret getting involved because it nearly ruined my life. That's not the right question. I regret becoming the kind of person who could look at another human being's family history and see only a financial obstacle. That way of thinking is far more dangerous than any single criminal act. If this confession has any purpose, it's to show that crimes rarely begin with dramatic moments. They start with tiny compromises, one rationalization, one excuse, one lie you tell yourself. By the time you realize how far you've crossed the line, turning back feels impossible, even though it never truly is. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. I never expected to write any of this down, let alone share it with strangers. Maybe it's easier to confess to people who don't know you. They can't compare the version of you sitting quietly in a coffee shop with the version capable of making terrible decisions out of greed and fear. I don't tell this story to ask for sympathy. I earned the consequences that followed, and I accept that some people would never forgive what I did. That's their right. What matters is that I finally stopped lying to myself. That turned out to be harder than admitting the crime. If you're standing at the edge of a decision that feels harmless because no one has been hurt yet, stop and think about who you're becoming. Every major mistake I made began with a small compromise that seemed easy to justify in the moment. Once I crossed that line, every next choice became easier and every excuse sounded more convincing. Money comes and goes. Reputation can sometimes be rebuilt. But the knowledge that you willingly betrayed your own principles stays with you far longer than either. If my story is worth anything, let it be a reminder that the easiest shortcut can lead to the longest road back to yourself.